patch of missing hair changed the world. Here's something nobody tells you about those stately portraits hanging in museums. The men in them were hiding something. A secret so scandalous, so personally devastating, that they built an entire civilization's fashion around concealing it. We're talking about syphilis. And wigs. And how one king's desperate vanity accidentally crowned an empire. Picture 17th century Paris. The air reeks of lavender, orange blossom, and something far worse. Men and women glide past with towering clouds of powdered hair stacked impossibly high above their heads. Some of these wigs were so tall they scraped the tops of carriages. So elaborate they required internal scaffolding just to stand upright. Some hid birds in cages. Actual birds. But here's what the history books skip over. Those wigs weren't a fashion choice. They were a cover-up. For over a century, it was virtually unthinkable for a European nobleman to appear in public without a powdered wig. These towering hairpieces weren't just decoration. They were deeply tied to status, politics, disease, and a secret that polite society refused to name out loud. And it all traces back to one of the most feared illnesses in human history. In the late 15th century, syphilis swept through Europe like a nightmare no one had words for yet. No antibiotics. No treatment. No mercy. Early symptoms were subtle enough to ignore, a sore here, a rash there. But as the disease progressed, it did something that, in the courts of 17th century Europe, was almost worse than death. It made your hair fall out. And in a world where a full head of long, lustrous hair meant power, nobility, and divine favor, where your appearance was your identity, your reputation, your very survival in the social order, going bald was catastrophic. Not just medically, socially, politically, existentially. Hair loss wasn't just a symptom. It was a confession. A thinning head whispered of scandal, of promiscuity, of disease. For the noble class, whose entire identity balanced on the knife edge of appearances, losing one's hair was the same as losing one's standing. And since open discussion of anything connected to sexuality was unthinkable, people did what humans have always done when faced with an unspeakable problem. They got creative. Men began hiding their patchy scalps beneath ornate hairpieces. Women wove in padded curls and elaborate additions. What began as a desperate medical cover-up quietly transformed into something no one predicted. A cultural revolution built entirely on the foundation of shame. But no trend truly conquers the world until it gets royal approval. Enter Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He was not merely a ruler. He was a living myth, a walking symbol of French immortality, engineering every detail of his public image with obsessive precision. His palace at Versailles was less a home than a stage set for the performance of power. His portraits were propaganda. His very silhouette was a political statement. So when Louis started losing his hair as a teenager, the problem wasn't vanity. It was existential. A bald Sun King was a contradiction in terms. His solution? He hired 48 personal wig makers. 48. And the wigs they created weren't just hairpieces. They were monuments. Towering architectural achievements in human hair, designed to extend his silhouette, amplify his royal presence, and transmute the vulnerability of illness into the invincibility of legend. The court took one look and immediately followed suit. Within months, every nobleman in France was wearing a wig in the royal style. Not because it was fashionable. Because refusing was tantamount to political suicide. To reject the wig was to reject the king himself. And so the perruque, the formal name for these hairpieces, became mandatory. Required attire at every court gathering, political meeting, and social event that mattered. But the wigs were doing more than projecting status. Beneath their powdered curls they were hiding darker things. Wigs could conceal not just thinning hair, but oozing sores, blotchy skin, lumpy scars left by syphilis and smallpox. They were masks that whispered of elegance where the body told only stories of suffering. Then there was the lice problem. With limited hygiene and no such thing as a sterilized comb, head lice were endemic. Wigs oddly offered a solution. Shave your head, wear the wig, and simply boil the hairpiece when it got infested. Wig makers developed elaborate techniques to clean, treat, and repowder their creations. It was essentially a spa day for your hairpiece. The powder itself became its own obsession. Most people assume powdered wigs were simply white, but the reality was far more colorful. Violet, blue, gray, pastel pink. Powders made from rice, starch, talcum, chalk, even plaster of Paris. Scented with lavender, rose, and citrus oils to cover the more persistent fragrances of pre-deodorant civilization. And then the whole thing exploded. Once nobles adopted the wig, everyone wanted one. Merchants, craftsmen, blacksmiths, Suddenly ordinary people were powdering their hair and strutting like aristocrats. The elite were appalled. One French noble recorded his horror at meeting a finely dressed gentleman who turned out to be his blacksmith's son. The wealthy fought back the only way they knew how, by making their wigs more insane. Bigger. More jeweled. More feathered. By the 1770s, nearly 1,000 professional wig makers worked in France alone. Some women's wigs required actual scaffolding. Birds, ships, miniature gardens on top of their heads. France even established an official wigmakers guild to regulate the booming industry. Wigs could cost months of a working man's wages. And yet everyone wore them. This is where we get the phrase bigwig, a direct, literal reference to those who could afford the largest, most extravagant wigs in the room. Power measured in hair. The wig empire lasted for over a century, then collapsed almost overnight. The French Revolution made powdered wigs a symbol of everything the people despised: excess, aristocracy, detachment from reality. One decade they were mandatory. The next they were dangerous to wear in public. But the legacy didn't die. It lives in our language, our portraits, our courtrooms, and in that odd phrase we still use today when we want to describe someone important. The story of the powdered wig is the story of human beings doing what we've always done, taking our greatest vulnerabilities, disease, shame, fear of exposure, and transforming them through sheer ingenuity and audacity into something that looks from a distance like power. So the next time you see one of those grand portraits, some stately figure floating in a cloud of white hair, gazing imperiously at the viewer, look a little closer. Beneath all that powder and pageantry, a patch of missing hair. And everything it cost to hide it.